Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we're learning how to stitch straight lines and grids over one of our spinning square blocks. Let me show you what the design looks like before we get started. Okay, so here's our quilting design, and if you're looking for this graph for you to mark your block, you can find it in the Building Blocks quilt pattern available at leahday.com. Okay, so here's our block, and to get started you're going to knock out this grid first. Just stitch in the ditch around it and then start stitching on these straight lines. You're going to work horizontal and vertical, and then you're going to end up basically somewhere along one edge. And here's how I went further. I stitched over and down and hit that point, came back up, and then was able to hit the stitch line and go to the next one. And so that you can basically stitch this way all the way around this block, running along these lines and stitching in the ditch at the same time. And so once you end up over here, you can do the same thing with the next one. So stitch down, come up, you're going to be working along that edge there, flow down over, same thing, down and over. So it's a good idea to sit here and trace this with your hand. You're going to end up somewhere right here, and then you can just start knocking out these lines. Fill to the corner, travel to the other edge, fill in these. The corners will be a lot faster, but that is a really good way to flow through that first spinning square and the second one so that you don't have to feel like you have to stitch everything in the ditch before you get started. So let me get on the machine and I'll show you how I flow through this in free motion. So here's the block on the machine, and I've already stitched it in the ditch and I've already started filling in my grid lines. Now again, this is the t-shirt fabric in this section, and so if it's shifting or moving on you, you really have to just kind of fiddle with it. This is why we stabilized it with French fuse, to try and kind of keep it under control. The fabric that I have got in this section is actually it is a cotton. It might be a cotton blend from a pair of shorts that my son used to wear, and it's stitching up just fine. So understand that even if the t-shirt fabric wasn't appealing to you, that any kind of cotton fabric, a decorative print, would be a great place to put it in this block. So I'm just finishing up this. One other thing, if you do find that your stitches just completely go haywire on t-shirt fabric or any kind of alternative fabric, don't worry about it. Just don't stitch this section. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to quilt it if it's not open to you. Okay, I want to make sure that entire ring is stitched in the ditch, so I'm going to go on ahead and stitch all the way to the corner and stitch that first line down, and that's going to ensure that I have my ditches completely filled. Something like that. Now I'm going to stitch down. I'm going to get to that point created by this little triangle, and then I'm going to work my way up on one of those lines. Now it's going to get dense right there because we've got several seam allowances all layering up. So you're going to hear my machine start to make a louder noise whenever I hit those spots. Because this block was paper pieced, we had to press our seam allowances open. So you're going to also deal with a lot more bulk. If you suddenly feel there's resistance to your block, like you're trying to kind of shove it, all of a sudden you're trying to shove it through your machine, it might be that your foot is just kind of, it's riding a little higher and kind of pressing harder against the block because of all those seam allowances. Okay, so we've stitched down and come back up, and now we're going to go down one more time, and that little section will be knocked out. I love it when I can flow through an area really quickly, and this is one of those times that I can just flow from triangle to triangle and knock out everything at once. The stitching in the ditch and those extra lines that we're stitching, those straight lines, all at the same time. So I'm going to keep flowing through this block, and I'm going to speed the camera up so that way you can see exactly how it works as I stitch it. Okay, so I'm getting started working on my next set of triangles, and again this one's going to flow through just like the other one. In this situation I'm stitching down so that I can hit this stitch, and then I'll come back up and stitch back down. Now the one thing you might see me doing a lot is kind of pulling on the fabric ever so slightly with my fingertips. I'm kind of smoothing and spreading. You see how much movement I've got there? A lot of that is due to the fact that the seam allowances were pressed to one side. When you press the seam allowances to one side, there's still a lot of, I think the best word is give, because the fabrics are kind of folded on top of one another, and they're, especially the top fabric that's folded kind of over and back along the seam allowance. You know, there's just extra bagginess there from where it was folded over, and so you're going to have that, you know, maybe tendency to kind of slightly puddle a little bit on the edges. So just try that. Just give it a ever so slight smooth and firm hold as you're stitching through this area. Now I ended up with some pretty big stitches right here, and the main reason, they're just 2 or 3 really big stitches, and the main reason is as I go from an area of density, this is a lot of intense seam allowances, a lot of height, that slows down my foot. As soon as I get out of that area, my hands are pushing kind of hard on the quilt. As soon as I get out of that area, my foot is no longer being kind of compressed, and all of a sudden my block moves freely, but my hands are still pushing hard, so that's why that's happening. So you kind of need to play an adjustment game. Oops, I just way stitched out the stitch. That's okay. You have to play an adjustment game as you come into or out of a level, an area of intensity, an area of lots of ditches, sorry, not ditches, an area of lots of seam allowances. You have to just kind of slow down and be mindful of that, be mindful of how the block is moving and what is being pressed against your presser foot. Like right there, that felt pretty intense, which is why I kind of slightly stitched out of the ditch a little bit. Those seam allowances, while you can't see them, they really can wreak havoc with your quilting as they press against your presser foot, and unless you're watching it, they can kind of make your stitches go out of control. So just watch out for that. Let me show you again what I mean about the ease of stitching kind of big stitches, especially into areas. Here I'm coming from an area of a lot of intensity, and it just feels like my presser foot's kind of pressing pretty hard. I'm kind of putting a lot more pressure in the quilt, but then all of a sudden I'm out of that area and it's a lot easier. It's a very subtle feeling kind of thing. The more you stitch and deal with that kind of stuff, the easier it will become. But even I stitched some big stitches and some tiny stitches into this block. It's not going to make or break it. It's still going to be a-okay. It's just one of those things to be mindful of and to understand, you know, that's one of the limitations of paper piecing. It might be accurate, it might look, you know, really crisp points, really perfect seams, everything like that, but the quilting of it is always going to be a little tricky because of those pressed seam allowances to one side. They're always going to be pressed to one side, and they're always going to be slightly tricky underneath your quilt top. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning straight lines in our spinning square block. We've tackled straight lines multiple times this year. Straight lines look beautiful on the surface of the quilt. They can be a little challenging to stitch in free motion, but I insisted upon putting them into every single block because we have to learn how to stitch this in free motion. We have to learn how to ditch our quilts in free motion. And by adding the straight lines, I think this block is really beautiful. I think it really stands out nicely. Just remember that all those seam allowances, just because you can't see them, doesn't mean that they're not there. And if you start having some issues with those areas of density, just check in with yourself. Say, I'm working into an area of lots of seam allowances. Bring your hands in and press more firmly down onto the machine. Slow your speed down. Control that foot pedal. And I'm sure you're going to be fine. I ended up with some big stitches thanks to those seam allowances. You might as well. Don't pick up your seam ripper. You don't need to rip it out. It's just fine. So I hope you enjoy this block and all that you learn with it. Of course, make sure to post your progress on the Free Motion Quilting Project or our Facebook group the Building Blocks Facebook group. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and join us as we learn how to piece and free motion quilt 42 blocks together. You can pick up your pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt!